This next conversation, a really important conversation about bolstering resiliency. And I'll be asking Janet Joseph, the Vice President of Innovation and Strategy at NYSERDA, who'll be moderating the next panel, to come on up with the panelists and start to get themselves settled in. And I'd like to welcome to the stage Ed White, who's the Vice President for New Energy Solutions at National Grid, to give us a little bit of an insight into National Grid. Welcome, Ed.
All right. Good morning, everyone. So, Cheryl, I've got 50 minutes, 50 slides. We're good with that? Exactly. I'll go through them very quickly, so if you guys could bear with me. So, as Cheryl mentioned, my name's Ed White. I'm the Vice President of New Energy Solutions. Some of you might be asking yourselves, what is New Energy Solutions? The best way I can describe it is if you look at the organization, and National Grid is, like Iberdrola, an international utility. We focus on poles, pipes, and wires and delivering safe, reliable service to our customers. But we're also in the innovation space. And we've been on this journey for quite some time through our offerings with energy efficiency. So to hear that last panel and the intersection between the technology that we have on the grid, the technology and the offerings we have, and the intersection with customers was really pleasing. If you look at the slide over there, those are the New York stats. We have over 10,000 employees in New York. We have 3.9 million customers, so 3.9 of our 7 million customers are here in the great state of New York. We're the largest distributor of natural gas in the Northeast, and you can read all the other stuff. The New Energy Solutions business unit is really, if you kind of look at the company and said, okay, 100% of the company, I would say, and don't quote me on these numbers, but 95% of everyone there is focused on the poles, pipes, and wires and the safe, reliable service. The 5% is our group, and we're really focused on what's next. So whether it's REV in New York or some of the other things that are going on in some of the other states, we're really charged with working with the marketplace, partnering, looking for opportunities to do demonstration projects. So the timing couldn't be better for our organization and all the activities that are happening here in this room. How do I switch the slide? Oh, look at that. There we go. All right. So I'm not going to belabor the challenges that we have, but a lot of them have been addressed. We've got the fluctuating utility bills. Prices are going up. Winter pricing is coming into play. We've got high cost of energy efficiency solutions. We've got the whole DER revolution. So what we've tried to do with our 4 demonstration projects is really look to see how can we get points on the board and make REV demonstration, or REV as a whole, real, right? Take it from a vision and make it a reality. So our 4 demonstration projects, kind of going from left to right, start out in Buffalo, where we're not only looking at sort of a campus-style DSP, so rather than do the DSP at the state level, we're looking to do it at a campus level, working with multiple different customers, looking at their DER resources, and actually running that campus as its own little DSP. In addition to that, and just like they were talking about in the earlier panel, we're also looking to do some work with integration of solar with a low-income community. So we've got a number of low-income communities that actually surround our service territory, and how can we actually get them in the game? There's plenty of stats out there that show that the solar revolution is really only touching 1 or 2% of customers across the country. How can we actually get them in the game? So our demonstration project is laser focused on accessing that opportunity. As we move east, and it's going to be tying nicely with this panel, we're thinking more about resiliency out in the Potsdam area, where we're working with Clarkson and really looking to see how do you actually do a microgrid, not just for the campus, but for the community. And so that's going to be one of our demonstration projects. And then lastly, we're looking at Clifton Park, just outside of Albany. And that's really sort of the utility of the future. How do we actually focus in on different pricing plans, different technologies, getting access to information and efficiency information so customers can get excited about energy and understand the true value of energy. So those are the 4 demonstration projects that National Grid is focused on. And if you can read that chart over to the right and figure that all out, we'll hire you to help us. But really, that was just sort of a one display where we kind of put all of the integration that needs to happen all on one diagram. And the reason we did it that way is because there's a lot of stuff that's happening, and a lot of sort of the slides look pretty, but there's a lot of work that has to happen. And it's a partnership with not only the utilities, but the marketplace and everyone involved, including our regulators that have to approve it. So then lastly, and this is the Potsdam, and this is where I turn it over to this distinguished panel, we're really looking at, how to improve methods for looking at regional resiliency. Coming out of all the storms, whether it's Superstorm Sandy or Hurricane Irene, what have you, everyone wanted a microgrid, but no one really knew what it was. So to Clarkson's credit, they and many others, along with New York Prize, are really focused on looking at what's the opportunity, what's the solution, and then how do you have a business model around it. So we're very excited to see that be one of our demonstration projects, and I'm also excited to hear with Janet and the panel here what's going on elsewhere. So thank you very much. And I think I'm on time. I didn't get the stop button, so we're all good.
Well, thank you very much, Ed. Great to have you up here. So this next panel is focusing on bolstering resiliency. I'm Janet Joseph, the Vice President of NYSERDA, and I'm pleased to be helping to facilitate this conversation. So clearly, the high-impact storms that we've had over the past few years demonstrate that the way we've approached resiliency in the past is not working for us today, and it probably won't work for us in the future. But we know we have some resiliency solutions out there, from microgrids, from solar battery systems combined to CHP. And our challenge is trying to figure out how to get those systems to scale. Now, these solutions have some barriers. We have a difficulty in valuing resiliency. We know we have some tariff and ISO market structures that are limiting the diverse value streams that these solutions can provide to the system. And a lack of customer awareness and maybe even customer confusion is really constraining the ability of these new solutions to scale. So that's the problem statement, but as one of my colleagues is very fond of saying, let's not admire the problem too long, let's just try to fix it. So what we're hoping that this panel here can help us do is shed light on how to fix it. So let me introduce the panel members. First, to my left, we have Vic Shao, who's our founder and CEO of Green Charge Networks, and this is a company that's providing energy storage solutions to reduce demand charges and help businesses save money. Very relevant topic. Next, we have Gary Wetzel, who's the VP of US Sales at S&C Electric Company, and Gary has worked on many aspects of electrical system reliability. And all the way on the far left here, we have David Hibbert, who is the Director of Business Development at SunVerge Energy. It's a leading provider of energy storage systems and specifically integrated solar storage systems, and participating in one of our exciting REV demos in Con Ed, which I hope to hear a little bit about. So I'm going to kick off the discussion with a few questions, and then we will pivot to audience questions. So please, members of the audience, start jotting down questions on flashcards, and we'll have some runners around to collect it. So let's start with a real basic question around resiliency. Does energy resiliency sell? Are customers willing to pay a premium for resiliency? Or does resiliency need to ride on the coattails of something that's more easily monetized, as in reduced demand charges? So let's open it up to the panel.
Sure. I would kick it off with a story from one of our customers in the New York territory, Walgreens.
Okay, is everybody mic'd up here?
I think so.
I think I'm mic'd up. So Walgreens, one of our early customers in New York, During Hurricane Sandy, at a number of their stores in New York City. Hold it. Maybe move it up. Okay. Is this better? I'm on.
You're on.
Okay. I'm on. Closer. Okay. Is this better? Can you hear me? All right. I don't think it's me then. What should I do? You want me to use that? Yeah. All right, I'll do that. Is this? Oh, okay. There we go. Now it's working. All right. Here we go. Let's try again. Do over. So Walgreens was one of our early customers in New York City, and during the storms, Hurricane Sandy, they lost power at a number of their stores in the New York area for a period of time, for a period of a week or in some cases longer. Now the CEO of Walgreens looked at the situation and said to himself, well, at these stores we have solar system on top of our roof. Why is it that when we have this outage, the solar system isn't working and providing some critical needed power to the stores? Of course, the answer is that the solar industry and energy storage industry, for that matter, because of IEEE 1547 and the UL regulations, are not allowed to backfeed into the grid during system-wide outages. So that's the technical answer to that question. But from a business standpoint, it does seem a little bit awkward, right? And what happened during that period of time is that Walgreens really wanted to sell supplies to the customer base. And really, for that matter, all they needed was cash registers and lights. That's it. That's all they need to run their stores for a period of time. Cash registers, lights. So that's really when we got involved with Walgreens and a number of the customers that we have in New York, is to start looking into this problem. To answer your question, Janet, I think there is a willingness to pay for resiliency because it makes business sense in the case of Walgreens.
Well, the same thing. Today in the marketplace, people do pay for resiliency. They pay for resiliency in the form of natural gas generators. They pay for small generators from Home Depot. There are a number of folks that I know of in New York, particularly from Hurricane Sandy, and folks that have solar systems that want to be able to take advantage of the renewable energy that are doing so with battery energy storage. The question is, can you actually make that resiliency work for the grid? Because today they really do treat them as isolated systems, and the expense is 100% of the burden of the consumer, and it's an underutilized asset in our view.
Yeah, and I guess the difficulty in that is, how do you socialize it? How do we make sure that Walmart can run their cash registers? How do we make sure that the police department has power so they can do what they need to do in terms of Superstorm Sandy, and yet pass those costs on, because there are costs, on the community as a whole? And in a lot of cases, the community as a whole is like, nah, I'm good for X amount of days or X amount of hours without power. So it is a challenge, and unfortunately it's a nationwide challenge, but it's 50 individual nationwide challenges because they're all regulated by individual states. And so how do we use the resources of solar or other renewable resources in conjunction with energy storage, because they kind of have to work together? And how do you use those, and how do you provide those benefits to the community where it needs to be provided?
So we're touching on a concept of willingness to pay, and I think there's some interesting work that will be going on as part of the Con Ed, SunPower, SunVerge demonstration around that. So Dave, maybe you can share with us what you're hoping to learn from that REV demo.
Yeah. So the concept behind the demo is that the energy storage that will be placed at homes ultimately has function for the grid. That's going to be its primary purpose. And then there is a method for which we're going to see what is resiliency worth to various consumers and how that will play out and how they contribute to those grid assets, essentially.
Now, how will you elucidate that from the consumers?
Right now, we're looking at what the test methods need to be, what the offers can be to the consumers, what uptake rates are going to be, and how they'll be structured. Honestly, it is a test. We have a feeling that there is value because people do want some level of resiliency. How much value is going to have to be sort of tested, and we're going to have to figure out exactly where that bar lies within the context of this particular program.
And the value of resiliency is different to different people.
True.
It's different to Walmart as opposed to you at home. It is different to, for example, the financial industry that runs millions of calculations through their data centers every day. Resiliency to that organization is incredibly valuable, and they pay for that privately in their backup power. Resiliency for my own home, we lost power for a day, but really, except for it being kind of hot, which is unusual for Chicago, but except for it being kind of hot, we kept the refrigerator and the freezer closed. The power came back the next day and everything went back to normal. And my neighbor said, gee, we ought to go invest in a generator. I'm like, gee, that's the first time that's happened in 15 years, so I think I'm good.
No.
So Vic, how do you go about approaching pricing for your combined resiliency services?
So we tackle the economic problem. I think we have to look at this from an economic standpoint because that's, from what Richard said this morning, that's really one of the underpinnings for what's going to scale, right? Is to study the market, study the economic problem. I think there's a certain population of C&I customer base out there, such as Walgreens, not Walmart, not yet, such as Walgreens, that would be willing to pay for a resiliency option for certain critical infrastructure, critical loads at their facilities. But if you can probably draw a parallel to data centers and how they have come up with a whole metrics and measurements around how many nines of uptime. And then those, 99.999% uptime, well, that's going to require so many extra hardware for redundancy purposes and so forth. And they have modeled it all out on a data center side of things. And I'll bet we can do the same thing here under REV or a similar construct to really study the economics of the problem and what is ultimately the willingness to pay for the different customer segments out there.
Okay. So let's move on to the topic of unlocking the value. So I'd like to hear from each of you in terms of your thoughts on how new tariff structures or ISO market structures could enable resiliency solutions to better capture and monetize additional value streams that can improve project economics. So if you could, snap your fingers and make a change in tariffs or a change in market structure, what would it be?
Some of the tariff structures, we have tariffs built in the Ronald Reagan era, and some of the tariff structures have barred the local utility wires company from owning generation. Okay, that may have made sense in 1980, but then some of them have taken that a step further and declared energy storage as a power generator. That doesn't make sense, and it doesn't allow the utilities the flexibility to make use of renewable energy in conjunction with energy storage to provide a resilient grid. And so the recognition of renewables and energy storage working together makes for a resilient grid, and I think that's one of the tariffs that needs to be updated, needs to be looked at.
David?
It's interesting. The complexity lies in that you literally have so many parties that you're dealing with. If you want to be able to share in the value of resiliency by using that capacity on a marketplace, really actually exercising it on a daily basis, you may have to cut a contract with the local utility, you may have to cut a contract with a third party, you may have to cut a contract with the ISO, you may need to file for compliance as within the market. There are so many soft costs involved in trying to wrap yourself around that complexity and exercise all of that value. That's the difficulty, because even though there is incremental value, and when it all adds up, it's actually worth doing. It's really hard to unlock that value because the soft cost of getting to it are very high. An example outside of New York, in the New England region, if you want to unlock the value of frequency regulation, you need to be able to come up with a megawatt worth of assets. You need to register as a market participant. You need to have telemetry that goes to a dedicated server for each asset, special meters, everything else. And these are just the types of market rules that prevent you from recapturing what might be, several $100s per megawatt hour in true value that you can deliver to the grid, but you can't get it there.
So what sort of changes would you like to see? Remember, we're pretending.
Yeah, I honestly, I think a REV-like process is the solution, because it is bringing all these parties to the table. Insofar as the ISOs and the IOUs are collaborative in how they view metering, how they view data, and they pull those pieces together, that solves that problem. Because at that point, you're working under one sort of fundamental tariff as a resource. If I could strike a pen tomorrow, I would literally have a tariff that says, you're a resource of this capabilities, you're worth this much to the state of New York and to the REV process, and then the state of New York would distribute that amongst the market players so that it would simplify the process.
Okay.
But I wouldn't overlook the existing program that's in play already in New York. Outside of, REV is terrific, and I think it needs to, carry out some of these demonstrations to their full fruition. But in New York, the demand management program, the DMP program, is currently, in production right now, and Green Charge is going through that process of validating the output. So we have a network of 4 deployments in New York that's going through that auditing process right now through the demand management program. So that's something that exists today and can be worked today.
And the economics under that scenario work for you and your customers?
It's starting to, as costs come down, I would say. So, battery costs, lithium-ion battery costs, have been on the same trajectory, I would say, as PV solar panels. And it's a very much so a logarithmic, steep cost decline. So as that comes down over the next 5 years, 10 years, I think a lot of these programs will become very economical.
So is that really the level of cost decline that you are expecting for your services, your combined services, a 10-fold cost decline?
Absolutely. I mean, I think if you were to ask some of the solar developers in the room 10 years ago where they thought the cost of solar panels would be in 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, the most aggressive person in the room wouldn't probably hit the actual number that we experience as an industry. So the same thing is happening in storage.
The battery prices for storage are dropping dramatically. Just in the last 3 years, one of our suppliers of lithium-ion batteries, prices in half. And Argonne National Labs outside Chicago has been working on lithium-ion, on trying to get 5 times the density, 5 times the amount of power out of the same battery at 1/5 the price in 5 years. Will they get there? Probably not. But if they got halfway there, that's pretty good.
Those could be game changers. So I want to switch gears a little bit to risk. So, resiliency is really all about risk. And if there is one industry that lives in that space, it is the insurance industry. So what can we learn from the insurance industry, whether it's on customer behavior or pricing, or maybe flip it a little bit? How can we partner with the insurance industry? Are there things we'd like to see the insurance industry do differently with respect to resiliency? So let me open that up. Oh, Nick?
So it's a question of data availability. Now, perhaps not insurance, I would draw a parallel to what NREL has done for the solar industry. They published data, solar production data, given the zip code, you could, approximate the number of kilowatt hours generated by a solar system over the course of a year. I think we need those kinds of benchmarks for storage, for resiliency, and I don't know if that comes out of the insurance industry or perhaps a governmental entity. But those kinds of benchmarks is what sets the stage for the commercial guys like us to sell and to get financing for the projects.
And I don't think the consumers at large, if you take a page out of the insurance industry, consumers at large recognize I need to have homeowners insurance. I need to have health insurance. I need to have car insurance. Because that's my personal, if something happens, I'm going to be out of pocket this personal amount of money. And on a day-to-day networking, that's not going to work. For the power industry, there's not as much recognition, and so I think there's an education process for consumers, industry in general, that there is a value to resiliency, and as opposed to cursing at the local power company when you're out of power because the storm went through. There is some education and recognition that there is a value.
Dave, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, absolutely. What's interesting is in the power industry, in the field of resiliency or reliability, there is an insurance industry. It's actually your utility. So they self-insure. When they have outages, they have to roll trucks. When their grids are fragile, they have to roll more trucks. And this is all reflected in the rates. I think if you were to take parallels with the insurance industry and look at how the electrics industry basically spreads that cost across ratepayers, you have an opportunity to say, rather than spread that cost to ratepayers, take that cost and apply it towards having fewer issues or fewer operational expenses as a result of storm damage and events. That's a risk loss policy.
And actually that's a problem in the investor-owned utility industry, because rolling those trucks is not in the rate base. The rate base is based on the installed asset. That's where the rate base comes from. So when they're dealing with operational O&M costs, that's the shareholders' cost. That is a completely separate cost than the ratepayers. And the utilities have to recognize that, which is why they're investing in capital structure. But that is a big problem that the utilities face, is rolling all those trucks really isn't in the rate base. And so the O&M costs are difficult for them.
Or even take it one step further. What can FEMA contribute to resiliency in the state of New York? I mean, they are the backstop for all the utilities for large events. Putting that money up front, having a more resilient grid, having consumers protected.
You mean the deeply funded FEMA? Is that what you
Yes.
Okay. I want to switch a little bit. We have a question from the audience that's, I think, a follow-up on a comment, Dave, you were making. So is Dave at Sunverge advocating for a standard uniform contract for energy resiliency in New York?
I don't know that I'm advocating specifically for that. I believe that if you had a prescriptive program in the state of New York, you remove a lot of barriers so that you can move very quickly. Outside of that, it's just looking at where items don't align. So if the mandate is that the IOU can't own the asset, then you immediately introduce two contracts. We believe in utility ownership. We think that's a good model for a lot of instances, depending on how you regulate those utilities and how you restructure to allow them to do that. Anything that simplifies the number of doors you have to go knock on and contracts you have to sign to unlock all of the value, make it more effective. If it's a prescriptive program, measured by the state, monitored by the states, and then redistributed, such as you do today with solar, that accomplishes that goal. But we're agnostic to how it gets done. We just think that's the big impediment today.
Okay. So I want to remind people, if you have questions, please pass it over to the folks that are going around collecting the cards. I think there's John over there in the back. Okay, another question. Ooh, this is on technology. Beyond storage and microgrids, is there a key enabling technology to speed resiliency efforts?
I think that's already ongoing. There are tremendous amounts of utilities that have been working on what we call distribution automation. Well, we called it that 20 years ago, and now somebody came up with this wonderful marketing term called the smart grid. But it's
now it's called the integrated grid.
Now it's the integrated grid. So I'm trying to keep up with the marketing terms, but it is the investments by the utilities to provide a grid that can reconfigure itself, because it's the great majority in terms of windstorms, and with the exception of a superstorm Sandy, but the great majority of the problems in the grid are transient in nature. And so for the ability of the grid to automatically recognize there's a problem in this circuit, and so we have to isolate that circuit, and then we have to try and bring as many people back to power as possible, and the utilities are all measured on their responsiveness of this. The ability of the grid to operate independently and do that is already ongoing, and there are many utilities going after that.
All the advanced analytics and controls that are built into our
the controls,
our complex
the smart devices that are out there, the automatic meter reading.
This is definitely a big part of the future of our resiliency. Vic?
And it's coming.
Yeah, I'll just chime in there. I actually don't think it's a technology challenge. It's more of a regulatory challenge, because the technology already exists. I mean, all that a residential homeowner needs is solar plus storage. That's it. That's resiliency right there. So, so getting that set up approved through the regulatory framework, so that it's a streamlined process, like it is for a solar only option, net metering, getting a critical low panel installed, have energy storage on site, having all of that interconnected through a standard process. I think that would solve 80% of the problem.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I think it's less a technology problem than it is an economic or regulatory issue. We were talking earlier about sort of the value of resiliency. It's apparent from some of the research we've done and some of the doors we've knocked on and looked at and talked to different folks. If you go to a wealthy neighborhood and you say, what do you do when the power goes out? They talk about their generator and their solar system and their assets. If you go to a poor community and you ask what happens when the power goes out, they tell you they sit there and wait. Yeah. Those are the issues that need to be solved.
So that is a very significant issue. So we've talked about willingness to pay. We've talked about installing solar and energy storage systems. So how do we get resiliency to those sectors of the population in our society that probably need it the most, that can't ride out 5 hours without an air conditioner, for example?
Sure. I'll start off. My belief is that if you have the ability to deploy renewable energy and energy storage for the benefit of the grid, for the benefit of all ratepayers, because these assets in aggregate can be managed as very dynamic energy resources. They don't have to go on specific homes where people contribute to that cost. They can go on the homes of disadvantaged individuals, schools, firehouses. And the benefit of resiliency is a latent benefit that can either be given to them or done at a de minimis cost. And the vast majority of the use of that asset is really for making the grid a stronger asset. And then a continuation of that is forming those particular sites into a larger microgrid from a technology standpoint. Then you expand those assets across the entire community.
Sure. I mean, you can put solar for a community and back that up with energy storage and have that serve the community that really needs it but cannot afford a solar panel and a battery in the house. Yes, a solar panel and a battery in the house would help everybody. Unfortunately, you're right, people that need that the most can't afford to put a solar panel on their roof and a battery in their house, because that's a capital expense that is just not financially viable for everybody out there. To put energy storage at the substation, to have that connected with solar or other distributed resources makes very good sense, and you can then provide that power to the community where the folks are getting, as David put it, a de minimis extra charge on their bill for resiliency.
So Gary, I have a challenge question here that came specifically to you.
Right at me?
Yeah, right at you, so let's just go for it. So why should wires companies be allowed to own and operate renewables generation? Why can't this be done by the private sector, promoting competition?
It's actually done in both sectors, but the reality is, David and I were talking earlier, the recognition that the grid is changing and the utility companies are actually best equipped to change the grid. The grid was built over 100 years ago to generate power over here, transmit it over wires that the wires company own, and distribute power to the communities at large. And now we have distributed resources that say, well, let's make it work in two directions. You really have two choices. You have to put storage, renewables, and the grid to work together, or you rebuild the whole grid, which isn't going to happen. And the folks that are best equipped to do that are the utilities, because they deal with that infrastructure all the time. We hear about microgrids, and folks are saying, well, gee, a microgrid, and so David's going to have a microgrid, and Vic's going to have a microgrid, and you and I are not going to have a microgrid. Well, who's going to own that? And when David says, well, I'm in microgrid and I'm going to deal with it on my own, that's great. But the utility is also obligated to have power to David and say, well, David may say, yeah, I'm not going to run the microgrid today. So the utility is obligated to provide power to him. Who pays for that?
Well, I'm sure there'll be a number of people who will want to engage you in the rest of that discussion at the break. So we'll just leave that one out there as a teaser. I have one last question, and then we're going to close. So I can't help but presenting this to a number of panelists that are working on energy storage. But I think, as we all know, Tesla, I said it, energy storage, is attempting to capture the public's imagination by introducing their, shiny new Powerwall. So do you think we'll end up in a world where storage as a partial resiliency solution is a mass market and default appliance? And how do we get there, and when? So let's start with Vic.
Well, so if you want to draw a parallel to the telecom space, it really didn't make a difference to the consumer until it can fit into the palm of your hand, right? Then all of a sudden the whole game changed, and once it's portable. So I really know what will happen with Tesla, but my belief is that until the energy storage device can fit into the palm of your hand and it's portable, you can carry it as a portable generator everywhere you go, then all of a sudden it will make a difference. I mean, currently you can't probably strap a Powerwall to your back and carry it around or anything. So I think that's still going to be a challenge for that segment.
David?
My answer is I certainly hope so. Our entire business is built on that premise. As we've sort of seen with the solar industry, there are more and more adopters. It goes from early adopters, it goes to maturity. I think, I believe energy storage is in the early stage today. It's still early adopters. There will be folks that want to buy a Powerwall simply because they want a Powerwall. It may never ever do anything on the side of their house, but they will do so. We, as an industry, SunVerge is largely focused on the aggregation of assets, management of those assets, and the software to be able to perform them. We don't make batteries. We buy them from other folks. So what we've been able to see is that Tesla has actually done a great deal to jumpstart the industry simply because everybody had to respond to what they had done. And that's what's caused a lot of the sort of general price decline that we've been able to take advantage of very quickly.
That's good. Well, let's end on that note. I want to thank the panelists for their insight and their discussion, and I hope we can make continued progress on this. So thank you.